Hello and welcome to the Monday, June 29th edition of the Cluster API Provider AWS Office Hours, a sub-project of both SIG Cluster Lifecycle and the Cluster API project. Just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted up to YouTube afterwards. And please do abide by the Kubernetes community code of conduct. In general, just please be excellent to one another. It looks like we have a relatively light agenda today, and I can go ahead and paste that link into the chat for anybody who's present at the moment. If there's anything that you would like to bring up, please go ahead and add it to the agenda, and please go ahead and add yourself to the attending list on the doc as well. It doesn't look like we have any PSAs today, unless Andy or Nadir, you have anything in mind?
I got a bug fix in for something on master, just that we recently had a community member add support for creating Bastion hosts, even if you bring your own VPC, but unfortunately it needed to be modified in two places so that we handled deleting two, and so that's now been fixed.
All right, great. And then I think we can go ahead and move into the group topics. And the first one is yours, Andy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we're going to try and get, excuse me, try and get an alpha of 055 out sometime in the next day or two. And the reason it's going to be an alpha is because it's incorporating conditions from Cluster API, which itself is still alpha. The 037 release of Cluster API is not final yet. So we'll do an alpha of 055, and then at some point in the next week or two, when Cluster API itself moves from alpha to released for 037, we can do the same thing for Kappa. So if there are any issues or pull requests that are open that are either or that are not currently merged and that are not assigned to the 055 milestone, please feel free to nominate them, either set the milestone yourself if you've got privileges, or just add a comment asking if you can get it in.
All right, sounds good. I do see that a PSA has been added. Do we need to go back and touch on that?
Yeah, just very briefly, I got a PR 1760 that rewrites the conformance testing to use cluster cuddle. Did a demo to SIG AWS last week, just as a way of maybe using cluster API to test things like external cloud provider and CSI, etc. So I'm not going to do it again here. If it should be in a recording for that.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for that. And looks like moving on, our next topic is Jay introducing AWS controllers for Kubernetes project.
Hey, everybody. Nice to see you. So I had a quick chat with Jason on Slack last Friday, and so some of you may remember a little project called AWS Service Operator that Chris Hine spearheaded. So a few of us at AWS, we've been rewriting the AWS Service Operator into a new project that we're calling AWS Controllers for Kubernetes. Anyway, it's a total rewrite of the AWS Service Operator, but we're aiming to have support for 6 base services in the next couple of weeks, and to throw out some preview code that folks can start playing around with. Jason was interested in maybe sharing some lessons learned between Cluster API AWS and the AWS Controllers for Kubernetes project, in particular around things like how we're handling rate limiting and throttling and the AWS API. And another thing that was of interest was how we handle multi-tenancy, which I hate using the term multi-tenancy, but it's when I say multi-tenancy, I'm referring to cross AWS account resource management. So we have some approaches for both of those things, and even though it's early stages yet, I thought I might reach out to you guys and see if we can maybe set up for a couple weeks, maybe a little demo or something like that, and reach out to you to see if there's some things that AWS folks can contribute on the cluster API AWS, and if there are particular topics like this sort of common rate limiting thing and throttling, where you guys have made a particular approach to that, and would like to chat about whether there's other options, I'm happy to get the conversation started. And I'll just apologize for not being very present for Cluster API or Cluster API AWS meetings in the past. It's been a struggle to get resources. So, but I'm here now, and hopefully we'll be much more communicative.
Thank you, Jay. And I know I was talking at a high level with Andy and Nadir both about this last week, which is what kind of prodded me to strike that conversation back up with you again. So I know from my perspective and seeing Nadir's comment in the chat, we're pretty interested in seeing how this develops and how we can use this to layer on top of for Cluster API, because I see a lot of value.
Yeah, exactly. So let me briefly describe our strategy for the cross account resource management, because I think it might be interesting for you. So each AWS service, right, S3, SNS, SQS, et cetera, will have its own service controller within the ACK project. We did that for security reasons, and I'm not going to go too far into that decision making, but in any case, the pod that the service controller runs as will have an IAM role associated with the service count for that pod through the IRSA, the IAM roles for service accounts functionality. Well, that IAM role will be associated with a particular AWS account. What we didn't want was for users to have to install a full Kubernetes cluster if they wanted to manage resources across multiple AWS accounts. We just thought it's like, oh well, we're not having a very great user experience if we're requiring people to set up an entire Kubernetes cluster just to manage resources across accounts. So what the approach that we've taken is we're having a config map that will store a relationship, a mapping between an AWS account ID and an IAM role ARN. And that IAM role ARN will represent the target IAM role that the service controller will assume into. So the service controller will call the STS assume role API call and essentially pivot its client into a target IAM role, and that IAM role will be in a different AWS account than the IAM role that the service controller pod is running under that service account, and the pivoted client will then manage resources in that target AWS account. The way that the custom resources that each service controller manages, there'll be an annotation called services.kates.aws/owner account ID, and that will signal to the service controller that the user wants to create or manage resources in a different account. So we're using this annotation for that signaling constraint. And what this essentially means is you can have these ACK service controllers installed into one Kubernetes cluster, and that's it. You don't need to install ACK service controllers, of which there will be many, because there will be a service controller for each of the services. You'll only have to install that and manage the lifecycle of those pods in one management cluster. So anyway, that's how we're thinking about that kind of stuff. And the throttling, the rate limiting and API throttling. So the app mesh controller for Kubernetes project just recently got redesigned, like another full rewrite. And they have created an API throttling package, Go package inside app mesh controller for Kate. So what we're doing is taking essentially the ideas from that throttling package and making it generic in the ACK service controllers, because ACK, all of the service controllers, including the implementation, are generated. There's no, we're not handwriting any service controllers. We can't do that for 160 plus services, so we have to generate everything, including the controller implementation. So anyway, we're going to be pulling in that throttling Go package from the app mesh controller for Kates and make it essentially generic for each of the services. So anyway, so that's how we're going to be handling that. Anyway, it's early days, but that's just a sneak peek into some of the things that we're working on.
All right, thanks for that, Jay. I don't know if either Andy, Nadir, or anybody else on had any questions for Jay.
I do, yeah. I guess you can't see that I have my hand up since your Zoom is messed up.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So this is really exciting, Jay. Thanks for the update. I had one question about the cross-account thing, and I don't know if this is more for us on the Kappa side or for you, but how would Kappa prevent a user from just saying, I want to provision in some other account ID that I shouldn't have access to?
Right. So the application, we kind of see these two different personas, right? You have the application developer, Kubernetes user, who frankly, they probably only know their AWS account ID. These are folks that may not even have permissions to log into the AWS console or have any experience using the AWS CLI tools or API at all. And then you've got a persona that's more of like that central IT team or admin. They will be the one, that central admin team will be the ones that manage the config mapping between an AWS account ID and the target IAM role. They'll still need to manage all of the IAM role and how you can essentially set in the permissions for an IAM role, the ability to assume role into a different role, which will be associated with a different IAM or AWS account ID. So the application developer user of Kubernetes, the ones that will be doing kubectl apply, the S3 bucket YAML, they will not need to know anything about an IAM role ARN or anything other than an AWS account ID. There's a separate persona that should be handling the setup of that mapping between a target IAM role ARN and an AWS account ID.
Is there anything to stop the first persona, the app dev persona, from, and this is the wrong word, but guessing an account ID that the service controller does have access to, but that they shouldn't have access to?
I mean, they could guess it. I suppose they could guess the account, but unless that central IT team has created the mapping between that AWS account ID and an appropriate IAM role that has permissions to be assumed into, the service controller will just respond back saying it's the resource is out of sync, and it'll have a condition that basically says permissions failure.
Okay. Nadir, Jason, does that sound like it'll be enough for Kappa, where, at least today we're either using the IAM role from the instance profile, or credentials associated with a single account. And I don't know how this jives with the multi-tenancy work that you've got going on, Nadir.
Yeah, I think the concern from our end was we wanted a stronger guarantee to prevent that kind of, to even protect against just guessing the ID. So what we have, I'll throw the link in the chat, is a bunch of CRDs that could potentially be made generic. They're currently going to be in Cluster API provider AWS.
Okay.
I think long term we might want to have it in the cloud provider and other places as well. But this, you would explicitly link global account resources to a cluster, and you have the ability to restrict which namespaces are allowed to consume each type of account principal. So that's whether it's so for the purposes of assuming role, you can do you can restrict by namespace. And then in the future, we do want to look at supporting the service accounts as well. But we were thinking of allowing that to be namespace scoped objects, because if you're
Right.
using service accounts, you can better restrict the cross account behavior anyway.
So the way we were going to, so yeah, I kind of left out the namespace default thing that we're thinking about. So the service controller for, say, S3 has a service account associated with the pod that's running that service controller. That service account has its IAM role, which is obviously what's running which the client that is in the pod is communicating using. Each of the CRs for, say, an S3 bucket you can create them within a Kubernetes namespace. And we were planning on building a defaulting mechanism into that Kubernetes namespace. So for instance, you can set the AWS account ID for all objects within that particular namespace to a specific value. And if the way that the service controller would do it is, if it sees that there's an override for that namespace, it would use that AWS account ID. And if not, then it would use the account ID from the IAM role that the service account for the pod is running under. That's one way we could do it, so that you restrict because only basically cluster admins can you can change the Kubernetes RBAC, right? So that only cluster admins can mutate a namespace's in values, right? So we could essentially set it up so that a normal Kubernetes user would not be able to override the AWS account ID from a namespace if the namespace has it set on there. Does that make sense? Would that be the sort of level of security that you'd be looking for there? I don't know if that made much sense.
It makes sense. I think that would meet what I understand to be the types of requirements that we're looking for. What do you all think?
So I think we also have some options here as well, because generally we're talking about in the context right now of a cluster API management cluster that's able to create clusters in different accounts. We could also limit, the access to the service operator to the users in the management cluster as well. And that's another way that we can limit some of this.
Talk me through how that would work. I understand that in Cluster API, you've got a management cluster that runs essentially as a super user, right, to create machine sets and machine deployments and that kind of thing. The permission set that, from a cloud provider perspective, the IAM permission set that Kubernetes user needs to have is essentially super user privileges on the AWS account, right? Because it needs to create VPCs, security groups, instances, all sorts of other things. Does it need to create IAM entities as well?
No,
It
not
does
today.
not. Okay. Well,
We make
that's
that a
good.
prerequisite step specifically so that, we're not interacting automatically with the IAM. But to give a bit more context, the scenario that I'm seeing is, we would like to leverage the service operator to interact with the AWS APIs for us, so that when we're, building clusters with Cluster API, we're basically interacting with the Kubernetes objects that
Exactly.
it
You're just
exposes.
writing
Um,
Kubernetes manifests and
yeah.
letting the service controllers do their thing.
So there's a certain amount of um, the multi-tenancy or multi-account handling that we can handle on that side, where the
Okay.
controllers would have access that kind of like a normal user who's just trying to create a cluster wouldn't necessarily have to create the backing service objects.
Okay.
Yeah, I think doing it at the namespace level, not allowing users to override would be helpful, along with what Jason said. Just let Kappa have the RBAC permissions to work with the ACK, but don't give it to other users on that cluster. The scenario that I was thinking about was just wondering, like, where does the account ID go, and is it exposed to the end user? Because what I would not want to have happen in a multi-user, multi-account environment where there's just one management cluster is say to the user, okay, you can go create a cluster, like give me your YAML, and by the way, put the account ID that you want to use on there. I'd want to have, because that bypasses any need for credentials, right? Like you just give it an account ID, the management cluster has that privilege, and it'll just do
Right.
it because you gave it an account ID. So if we can
Right.
say the person who is an IT administrator setting up this management cluster configures each namespace with the account ID that it's allowed to use, and then you use RBAC to give somebody access to the namespace, presumably you're giving them permission to use that
Right.
AWS account.
It's almost like we need attributes-based access control. I'm just kidding.
But you see what I'm saying, right? Like,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
do.
want
I
somebody
do
to take,
completely. I do
yeah.
completely. I will. So we have an engineering doc that's being refined and iterated upon for this cross-account resource management stuff. I'll add that as a dimension to the discussion topics.
Yeah, we just need some way for, like, there needs to be like Kubernetes RBAC where an administrator can set the account ID on some resource like a namespace, and then the non-admin user can go say, hey Kappa, please go create some clusters for me, create some machines, whatever.
But
But
not have the AWS account ID returned in the list of
yeah, like
properties, right, for the
you,
spec.
yeah, like if you're an admin and you want to fiddle around with Kappa using the ACK, then you go configure everything and it's all good, and you stick the account ID in on your namespace and everybody's happy, or you just do it on the ACK. But if you're working in one of these multi-tenant environments, there needs to be some segmentation between who can assign the account IDs and who can create the clusters.
Can we hide information in CRs from certain sets of users?
No.
Or yeah, okay. That's a wrinkle.
You can create CRDs that store information like that mapping that you were talking about that's going to be in a config map, and restrict it to just cluster admins so that regular users don't even, like, they can't list them, they can't get them, they can't create them. You can put it as annotations on a namespace, and not give regular users the ability to edit namespaces. But yeah, it has to be on some resource that a non-admin or
Or
somebody with
some
lower
resource that can be separately
yeah.
Controlled as far as RBAC. Got it.
Yeah. So like, a regular user is going to be creating cluster API resources, and they need admin on those, but yeah, separate resource for where the account ID goes.
Sorry to
Alright.
take up all this time talking about.
No, it's good. I mean, like Jason said, the agenda was fairly non-existent. So a lot of times these meetings go like 10 minutes. So this is great.
Yeah, and you know, at least from my perspective, I'm super interested in seeing how we can take this, because I think it, you know, helps us on, you know, the cluster API side, ensuring that the things that we're doing are doing what they say a lot easier than having to interact and build all that custom logic around the AWS SDK.
Yeah.
But if there aren't any additional questions there, does anybody else have any group topics for today?
Actually, I have just one more comment on that.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Sorry, Jason. So Jay, you did mention conditions, I think, that y'all were going to be using on the different resources. So what I wanted to request that you take to your engineering team is conditions would be fantastic for us to have visibility into what's going on. So I don't know how closely you followed events and conditions in Cluster API and Kappa.
I've been reading through the various email or the mailing list threads about update condition, you know, and the documentation around it and best practices.
Yeah.
Do we see any sort of resolution there? I mean, last I checked, it was somewhat like half and half.
Well, so
People.
we're going full steam ahead with conditions in the Cluster API family of
Okay.
repositories.
I was planning to as well.
Yeah, so what we have some internal users that are using Kappa, and we ended up adding several Kubernetes events to Kappa that it emits as we create a VPC and the NAT gateway and the internet gateway, and we, you know, do all the
Right.
AWS isms.
Right.
So we're going to be converting those to conditions, and we definitely would love to see the same amount of detail available to us from the ACK as resources transition from pending to being created to finishing being created. Like, you know, as much detail as we can get around the
Got it.
status so that we can report it back to whatever is using Cluster API.
Got it. I should have probably mentioned that ACK does not use CloudFormation at all. So that's probably the biggest difference between the AWS service operator and the new design is we're not using CloudFormation at all for any of that. So I'll just leave it at that. so I'm 100% with you, Andy, on getting a common set of conditions to represent state transitions. We have a start on that, and maybe next week or the week after we can discuss you know, specifics on those different conditions and what, well, like, you know, polarity to make them and all that kind of stuff, all that good stuff.
All right. Any other questions for Jay? Nope. Any other group topics for today? If not, we can go ahead and jump into the issues.
Sorry, my internet flaked out, but it's hopefully going to get resolved tomorrow.
Let's see. Oh. All right, issues without any milestone. You got one, fails to create one of 3 NAT gateways.
I'm probably going to look at that next, actually. I think we need to fix it before we do release.
All right. Do we already have a milestone for the release?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
I created it.
We got AWS cluster specs, control plane load balancer field should be mutable. Let's see. So in this case, they wanted to go ahead and flip cross-zone load balancing that was previously set to false to true. Anybody feel highly on milestone for this?
I kind of want some time to read through it and understand the details.
Yeah.
My gut feeling is 05X.
All right. Thinking important soon, long term, or just
I
defer
would
on
go
it?
with important soon, probably. Gab, I know that you've been doing conditions work. Do you have any bandwidth to look at something like this?
I should be able to take a look. I'm just wrapping up the cluster conditions update today.
Okay, thanks.
All right. We got deleting a cluster in an unmanaged VPC, attempts to release elastic IP. And you think that might be related to the NAT gateway issue, Nadir?
I think so. ELBv1, if it's anything to do with ELBv1, though, it's going to be annoying because describe load balancers doesn't give you a lot of information. So I'm hoping it's that, but I can look at.
This sounds like it, based on the anything else you'd like to add paragraph, we might just need to move some calls around.
Yeah.
Like this could be a pretty simple fix, maybe.
Are you leaning towards 055 or 05X here, Andy?
Well, I don't know. I would so it's because of the IAM role that I'm wavering here. Like if you have that permission, then it's not harmful and could wait. But if you're like Andrew here and you have that blocked, then you just flat out can't delete with an unmanaged VPC. So I don't know. Let's maybe do it X and see if anybody's available to work on it.
Sounds good. And then Kappa consuming a good portion of AWS API limits.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, I know Nadir, you had your update today about like if we if we batch up 2 or 3 describe calls that we could maybe increase our number of clusters that we can scale up to and reconcile healthily. I'm wondering if that's something that we want to try and do like in the next week or two, using channels and go routines to do the batching, or is that like going to be kind of annoying because it's going to have to go for every single thing that we want to batch up, and it's it's going to band-aid from one describe call to the next.
Yeah, I'm a bit unsure about doing it this week. Basically, I think 05X seems realistic, more realistic than 055.
So 5x.
Mm-hmm. And we have review potential bug in EC2 service instance if exists.
I pulled it out of a comment that you had left on APR, Jason, on the
Yeah.
conditions PR.
I think this is, it's a pre-existing bug if it is, so I don't think it's something that we need to rush in for 055. And then add unmanaged VPC Boolean to AWS IAM configuration. What were you thinking about timeline and priority for this one, Nadir?
It is not urgent at all. So 05X. Robert's using Terraform anyway for those bits.
Thinking important long term for this then?
Yeah.
All right. That's that. Let me look at the outstanding pull request too. So some of these are relatively old, but validation around fields that are passed in as AWS API parameters. I don't think that's anything that we necessarily need to get in for 055.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some linting issues that we needed fixed in that PR, but I haven't reviewed it other than I saw that comment come through.
And then allowing configuration of Bastion host ingress rules.
This one I'd like to get in. We have some downstream folks who are interested in seeing it. So this one needs some resolution, and we've got time, so maybe we'll talk about it now. So if you have regardless of if you have the Bastion enabled or disabled in Kappa, Kappa will create a security group for the Bastion and set up all the ingress rules so that the Bastion security group is allowed to SSH into the node security groups for control planes and workers. This PR is allowing you to specify the ingress CIDR blocks for that Bastion security group so that it's not just worldwide open. But what we're trying to figure out is disabling any CIDR block. So basically saying, maybe I'd like a Bastion, but I don't want to set up any ingress rules. So I'm going to manage that with a different security group, perhaps. And the question right now is, if the Bastion is disabled, does it make sense to set up that Bastion security group, which is the current behavior, or would it be okay to disable it entirely or not create it? And the reason that this is coming up is because with Kubernetes and Go and data types, it's basically impossible to reliably distinguish between a nil array and an array with 0 elements. And so what Aaron was trying to do was allow you to specify CIDR blocks nil, and you would get the default behavior, which is open to 0, 0, 0, 0. But if you specified CIDR blocks bracket bracket, you would get 0 rules. And in both cases, it would create the security group. And I talked with Jordan Liggett, who said, yeah, don't try to distinguish between nil and an empty slice. So we either could add another Boolean, which basically says, don't make me, I don't want any ingress. Still create the security group, but I don't want any ingress. Or we can just say, if enabled is false, we're not going to create that security group. So that's where we are right now, is do we need to create another Boolean, or can we change the behavior so that enabled false means no more security group.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge we'd have here is if for some reason somebody did want to create the bastion after the fact, we would end up in a weird situation to where we could create the security group, but we'd have to wait for the machines to re-reconcile to have that security group or subset of rules applied on
Is
that
it
end to actually
machine
connect in.
reconciliation or cluster? Because the cluster's the one that's doing the control plane and node and worker node group management, right?
Right, but if we're going to have an absence of the security group, in the case that the bastion's not there, enabling the bastion on the cluster would create the bastion and security group, but you might have lag before the security group is applied to the rules that are on the individual machines.
Because of, I mean, but it would still be the AWS cluster reconciliation, right? It would just be AWS eventual consistency getting through.
Well, you would have the
That's why
AWS
we
cluster
need
port of it to create the security group and apply it to the bastion, stuff. But then you would have the other side of the machine to update its security group to be able to reference the newly created bastion security group.
Okay, Nadir filled in what I was
Yeah.
missing. Thank you. So, I mean, the least risky is to add another Boolean of dubious name that just says disable ingress or something. And then CIDR blocks has to be nil/empty. Otherwise, it's a validation error.
Yeah, and I think that's a better way to go because we wouldn't be changing behavior in a patch release. And then we can probably plan for the next breaking release to change the default behavior too.
Okay, so if y'all have strong opinions, there's a comment down below around the name of that Boolean. So feel free to suggest whatever you'd like.
All right. And then let's see. Bring your own control plane subnets. I think you had given this a look, Nadir, and thought that it needed some additional changes.
Yeah, right now it copy paste the whole subnet spec again, so it includes a load of creates a whole bunch of API features which are not actually respected or used in any way.
All right. So we should probably leave this out of the 055 milestone for now. And support AWS multi-tenancy. I think that's probably similar.
Yeah.
The conditions on AWS machine, I do think that is something that we want in. And then etcd EBS volumes and that I think that's safe to leave those out for now as well. So unless there are any issues or PRs that anybody else would like attention on, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up for today then. So thank you all and see you all next week.